Hi, everyone. Welcome and thanks for joining us here for our event with Alex Riley for his debut book, Cure for Darkness, The Story of Depression and How We Treat It, which is a look at the treatment of depression, which blends journalism, science, history, and memoir. He's in conversation today with friend of the store, Steve Silberman, author of the New York Times bestseller, NeuroTribes, The Legacy of Autism and the Future of Neurodiversity. My name is Evan Karp. I'm the events manager for Booksmith. We're an independent bookstore and a mainstay of San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district since 1976. So thank you all so much for tuning in. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce Alex and Steve. So Steve Silberman is an award-winning science writer and the author of NeuroTribes, The Legacy of Autism and the Future of Neurodiversity, which Oliver Sacks called a sweeping and penetrating history presented with the rare sympathy and sensitivity. The book became a widely praised bestseller in the United States and the United Kingdom. His TED Talk, The Forgotten History of Autism, has been viewed more than 1 million times and translated into 35 languages. He lives with his husband, Keith, in San Francisco. And Alex Riley is an award-winning science writer and the author of A Cure for Darkness, The Story of Depression and How We Treat It, which is his first book. He received a Best Feature Award from the Association of British Science Writers for his reporting on the Friendship Bench, a project that began in Zimbabwe in 2006 and has since provided mental health care to thousands of people in New York. A former research scientist, he's co-authored peer-reviewed scientific papers while working at the Natural History Museum in London. Since leaving academia in 2015, he began writing popular science articles for magazines such as New Scientist, PBS's Nova Next, BBC Future, Mosaic Science, Aeon, and Nautilus magazine. He lives in Bristol. Alex, congratulations on the book. Thank you so much for being here. And Steve, thank you for joining us. I'm happy to stop talking and turn it over to you two.
Thank you for that beautiful introduction. And I just want to say, Alex, congratulations, because I know how not easy it is to write a book. And I remember sitting with you. Local people watching this will know the Reverie Cafe with its beautiful garden in the back. I remember sitting with you in the garden, and you were telling me about this book that you were maybe writing, and I thought, wow, like he really took on a big subject, and it sounds like he's going to do a really deep dive. And I was so happy when I finally got the book and saw that it was just so beautiful and such a tricky blend of personal stuff and history stuff and science stuff to pull off in a way that's really engaging. And A Cure for Darkness is a really engaging book. So I just want to congratulate you, Alex. You did a really excellent job.
Thank you. That's pretty kind.
Yeah, sure. If I can start with a very general question, because I understand that many people who might be listening might not have read the book yet. The question that I was asked most frequently after I published NeuroTribes was, do you have a kid on the spectrum, or are you autistic yourself? And the assumption was that who would write about autism if you didn't have a personal connection, which I thought was actually kind of a not great assumption. But you have a more personal relationship with depression than I had with autism. Just to start the conversation, could you please explain how your own experiences helped inspire you to write the book originally?
Yeah, sure. And thanks for being so kind, both of you and Evan. It's I have to pinch myself sometimes, and it's still not really sinking in. Just being here, speaking to you, and I wish we could have been in San Francisco, but here we are in our living rooms, and that'll have to do right now. Yeah, I have a huge personal side to this story, and a lot of it wasn't included in the book. But like you say, I've tried to weave my own personal story into the history of depression and its treatment. And that's not how I started out. I started out with a project that was really, really vague. I'm not really sure. I wasn't sure what I was going to do with the sort of frustration I was feeling of being on a very high dose of medication, being put through different psychotherapies that weren't really working for me. This is in 2016, 2017. And that frustration, then I channeled that into kind of trying to understand what was out there in treatment and what my doctors perhaps didn't know about. And I just thought that there has to be more than this. And if there isn't, then I'm going to be in an even worse state. And, so it was kind of curiosity, frustration, and this sort of pursuit of understanding that I think really drove this book. And then once I had this idea of, writing a book about depression, it just, opened up this whole new world to me. I was like, I need to understand not just my own experience, but how the experience of someone, for example, in Zimbabwe or India, or, the global perspective. And then I could also reach back into the millennia of different sort of terms of melancholia and see how our understanding has changed over that course of time. So yeah, and I did find a lot of hope, and I found a lot of empowerment from the studies that I was reading. And because I was already a science writer, struggling at the time to be a science writer, and really not earning a lot of money, and thinking maybe this is why I'm feeling this way. And so I just turned, instead of writing about gecko skin or beavers or these things I used to write about, or coral reefs, I started to write about myself and understand mental illness, it dawned on me that I'd never really considered it before. And then in 2017, I was like, this actually is something that I need to do.
Well, you did it very well, and you get right into it at the beginning of the book, your own personal experience as well, which is great. And in fact, I know I'm going to be, my next book is on cystic fibrosis, and it's in particular on a friendship that I have with someone with cystic fibrosis that wouldn't have even happened without a bunch of medical breakthroughs that have been fairly recent. He would have been dead in infancy, really, if those things hadn't happened. So I'm going to be using your book to inspire myself to write more personally in my next book. So thank you for that.
I mean, you say that about cystic fibrosis, that, he might be dead, but it might be the same for me. Treatments, if I was born before antidepressants and evidence-based psychotherapy, it could be the same situation.
Wow.
So I might not have been speaking here, which is, I think, it's a privilege to be alive at this time in some ways. Cystic fibrosis or depression. Yes.
Well, yeah, that's wonderful. What are some of the central myths or misconceptions of depression that you hope to challenge or dispel by writing A Cure for Darkness?
I didn't want to dispel any myths. I think that's not how I went into this, but then, and I went into a lot of the myths believing them, and I had to change my own mind numerous times. So at the start, like I said, I was on a very high dose of medication, and it wasn't working. And so I thought, this isn't how we should be approaching this. And now, thankfully, I have found a combination of medication that really does help me, as I discuss at numerous points in the book. So one is that antidepressants don't work. They don't work great, I think is probably more accurate. Like they are really life-saving for some people. Other people, they just come with side effects, and they probably should have had other approaches. The myth that depression is a product of civilization is another one that I wanted to tackle by reporting from low-income countries where the true, or the most dangerous triggers of depression and mental illness is poverty and domestic abuse and unemployment. It's really not about civilization and the rush of urban life, which is it's a myth that kind of grew out of I guess it was like 18th century philosophy that's kind of lingered into the modern day. But I mean, civilization isn't great. It might, lead to quite a lot of distress. But I wanted to focus on the known triggers for depression, and that really took me to low-income countries and seeing the amazing work that was going on in countries like Zimbabwe and India, where I think we can probably go into that a bit later on, because that's a whole topic in itself. And I guess the third important myth is, I went into the book thinking that electroconvulsive therapy was this barbaric throwback to, you know, a time when I couldn't really pin when this happened in my head. It was just like, it was a bad thing that happened in the past.
Right.
And only when I kind of learned about, you know, it was invented in 1938, which is quite modern compared to a lot of treatment.
Right.
And yet films still kind of depict people getting this treatment from the 1920s. I think there's a film with Angelina Jolie, directed by Clint Eastwood, is it? And yeah, she it was set in the 1920s, and yet she has electroconvulsive therapy. So it's just,
Oh, wow.
I mean, it's a common misconception that it's a real, like, barbaric old treatment of psychiatry.
Yeah.
It was a horrendous treatment. It was
Mhm.
it could fracture people's bones, and it wasn't a pleasant experience, but it was remarkable for its effects on really severe psychotic depressions. And then I've tracked that myth through time to present day, and, you know, witnessed and met with patients who receive ECT today, and just how it needed that transformation. And it's still a aggressive treatment,
Mhm.
but I think people need to understand how severe depression can be.
Mhm.
I wouldn't have ECT. My symptoms just wouldn't match that aggressive form of treatment.
Mhm.
But for people who are actively suicidal, the
Mhm.
delusions are making them think that their insides are rotten, and it's a really,
Mhm.
like, it's a disease that few people would be able to kind of even connect with or empathize with.
Mhm.
And it's remarkable how well ECT works on that particular type of depression.
Mm. Well, I think, I think some of the bad buzz that ECT got was because mental asylums were such terrible places, back in the 30s and 40s, and ECT would be used by, unethical practitioners as punishment, really.
Yeah.
So the actual medical benefits got sort of lost in fear of that. But yes,
Yeah.
I've spoken to people who've had it, and it did help them with their depression.
And some people prefer it to, if you've got severe depression, they might put you, psychiatrists might give you antipsychotics, and atypical antipsychotics are really, really damaging for your metabolism, for your just general health, your immune system. So some people that I've spoken to who have ECT told me that, yes, I prefer, if I didn't have to have this treatment, I wish there was another way, but I do prefer it to the other option, which is medication.
Right. This is kind of a craft question. Your book is very, very compelling and readable at the same time that it's kind of information and history packed. What were some of the challenges of turning figures from case histories and papers and other historical research into engaging characters in an extended narrative?
I guess choosing who you would focus on. I think you've got to choose interesting characters, interesting people. But I think everyone has an interesting, like, why did this person get into this area of research? Why are they studying depression? And as soon as you start to ask these questions, and there's an element of, you have to gain the trust of whoever you're talking to, and they need to trust you that their stories are going to be safe with you. And I think you don't have to do that with people from history. Sigmund Freud couldn't care less whether I write about his cocaine addiction. Like, he's long gone, and it's all done. His descendants might care, but they probably won't. And it's a very different way of treating it. And maybe this I haven't really studied it in my own book, but maybe there is a change from people who are dead and people who are still living, and maybe there's a different way of humanizing them. But people from the past, I think, reading through their letters is one of the best sources of information in how to create and understand their characteristics, how they express themselves. And I do worry how in a digital era and encrypted messages, like it's great that we have these safety sort of things, but also for historians, there's going to be this point where we just can't understand how people communicated and how people express themselves. Like Sigmund Freud, he's kind of seen as this very dogmatic, very confident character who's just almost like aggressive in his writing style. Then you look at his letters to his fiance or his favorite sort of colleagues, and he's really just an intimate, very funny, and also quite very low self-esteem for much of his life until in his later years. And I think that's probably one of my greatest sources. And also I just enjoyed it. It's probably a weird thing that I enjoy, but reading through their letters is actually quite fun. In the Freud museum in Vienna, it was a real a good day out for me.
That's great. And I completely know what you mean. I actually just, in this really obscure archive, I just came across a single letter, and I could so easily have missed it totally. And it was a single letter from a very, very important historical researcher in my book. And right before she made this huge discovery, she's writing to her mentor and she's saying, I don't know what I'm doing. I think, my career might be over. Like, I have no idea where I should go from here, and then like 2 years later, she made this world-changing discovery. Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. You mentioned Freud, obviously. How did two of the pivotal characters in your narrative, Sigmund Freud and Emil Craiglin, embody two different or complementary ways of conceptualizing and treating depression?
Yeah, they were really helpful in in the narrative of the book, in the sense that Freud, he starts off with this. They both start off from a very similar background. They both started in anatomy. They both got disgruntled and disappointed with it. They didn't see where it was going, and then they kind of took very different paths that would then trace, I guess, it overlapped throughout the 20th century, but at the start of the 20th century, they would kind of both, one would go more psychological approach and the other would go more biological, like neuroscience and chemistry, and that was Emil Craiglin. Freud would go down the psychoanalysis route, which he's most famous for, and that allows the structure of the book to kind of almost like make its own way through the history. And it took me a long time to actually, I don't have discrete chapters between these two characters. That I couldn't tell the story I wanted to tell by having them separate. Their stories had to be interwoven, and you see how they start to sort of like fray and sort of separate. And I don't think that history is ever that neat. I don't think that they did have these really discrete, like pure 100% psychological and biological, but it allows you to kind of frame this, like you say, it's an incredibly complex topic, and allow the readers to sort of have some mark to go back to. So you can then introduce the biological treatments such as antidepressants and ECT, lobotomies, unfortunately, and the more modern forms of anti-inflammatories, and also then the psychology of it, the CBT, the interpersonal therapy, the psychoanalysis, and how they would then come back together in my own treatment, and also as I mentioned in psychedelics, where these two fields of the psychological part of the treatment of depression and the biological, the drugs, come together in this sort of big bang of kaleidoscopic color in psychedelic therapy. And yeah, that just seemed to frame the book. But that structure really took pretty much the entire time, 4 years of writing the book. It didn't come naturally. I think it was it was a process rather than a starting off with that in mind.
Yeah, you did a really good job. after doing such a deep dive into the history of treatments for depression, what are some of the things that you changed your own mind about in the course of writing the book?
Like I said, antidepressants. I have a much more positive view about them, and also I still have that very negative. I do think that they are overprescribed through no fault of doctors or general practitioners. They don't have the time, and there's a whole pharmaceutical sort of big pharma angle to that as well. I had to change my mind about psychoanalysis. I thought it was pseudoscience, which a large part of it is. I thought that it had no place in, because this is a popular science book, I started off thinking that it had no place in this book. And then I actually started to, research, the early studies of Freud and Carl Abraham, who came up with the idea of hatred being swirled into a depression, which Freud then probably stole a little bit. And you saw that in the letters. And Carl Abraham, this really sort of stoic, lovely man, then has what in one letter has this sort of little bit of a breakdown and writes the longest letter he's ever written to Freud, stating that he came up with this theory first. But it's so well put that he's not once is he overly critical. He doesn't want to anger the great Sigmund Freud. And then from Carl Abraham we have John Bowlby, his work, Melanie Klein. So these psychoanalysts, although I don't agree with some of their theories, I think they were integral to the psychological treatment of depression. And also a lot of them accepted the biological approaches. So they did have the science mind, and they knew that their treatment was also a very powerful way of digging into more deeply embedded depressions that might come from childhood trauma. And yeah, what else did I change my mind about? ECT, like I said. And I think psychedelics, I came away feeling like we need to learn a lot more before we come to conclusions. I thought they would be the next, amazing breakthrough. I think that there's a recent study published in the New England Journal of Medicine and showing that it has some benefit over standard SSRI, escitalopram, but this is psilocybin, magic mushroom, but the significance wasn't it wasn't great, and actually didn't reach significance in their trial. That doesn't mean that they aren't going to be, but I think we do need to temper some of the hype around them and really wait for the studies to show us that they are effective. So, and that said, I've just got great respect for these drugs that have been used by indigenous populations for millennia. I think we should never forget where they truly came from. They didn't come from a lab. LSD did, but these cultures of in Siberia and the Middle East and famously in South America, they're not just drugs. These are powerful cultural identities that we should really respect. And I think they do have a future in psychiatry.
Yeah, I remember reading a book called Straight with the Medicine, which was about peyote ingestion in a traditional culture. And it was such a deeper take on psychedelics than even the psychedelic advocates in America were making. And it was very much about, it didn't, I don't think it directly addressed depression, but it addressed sort of losing your way in life and losing a sense of belonging to the culture that you're in. And yes, I'm really glad that you make the point about how these substances have been used in traditional cultures for millennia. And, it's too bad that there was so much hype and hysteria, equally on the part of the advocates like Timothy Leary back in the 60s, because that it gave the government an excuse to really shut down serious research on psychedelics. And
Yeah.
Anyone who has ever taken psychedelics, and I certainly have, knows how powerful they are. And we could know a lot more about them than we do. Like, it
Yeah.
seems like our knowledge seeking was placed on pause for several decades.
Yeah. And that's why one of the researchers I spoke to, he works at the Maudsley in London, and he's actually quite happy that he's a huge advocate of these drugs, but he's also quite happy that they're Schedule 1, which it means that they have no supposed medicinal value, which is ridiculous. But at the same time, because they're so highly regulated, he thinks that's going to prevent a history from repeating itself and having another Timothy Leary sort of episode, and hopefully that'll allow the politics to stay a bit out of it. And yeah, I think that hopefully with it being regulated, we can actually understand them better. That's why I also focused on people in Brazil, because they're more in tune with the cultural side of things. I think, the guy I spoke to, Draulio Araujo, he has, taken ayahuasca several times. He just has a huge respect for the drug, for the tea. And I think that brings some humility, and I found his story to be really incredible. And he works, as he says, in the psychedelic country of the world. So
yes, yeah. You mentioned just now your work in Brazil, and you mentioned India and Zimbabwe earlier. What did you learn about how the cultural framing of the experience of depression affects both treatment approaches and actual depression?
So actual depression, I think, is probably the best way to start. This is another actually thing that I didn't really kind of, I had to change my mind about it. I thought depression was depression, but then when you look in across different cultures, actually depression isn't the word or the descriptor that would be most associated with the actual illness of depression. And that's partly because of the language, and it's also partly because how people express themselves within their culture. So you have to have local idioms that really describe how their emotional world is. So for example, in Zimbabwe, they don't have a word for depression. Melanie Abbas, one of the psychiatrists I follow through her work in the 1990s to today, she had to kind of gain the trust of the locals, the religious leaders, and really sort of integrate herself within the community of low-income neighborhoods in Harare, the capital city of Zimbabwe. And only by doing that did she then, did the depression almost reveal itself to her, that she found, they didn't call it depression, but they did call it something called, there was something similar called kafungisisa, which means thinking too much. And that really got to the sort of cognitive, ruminative part of depression, like just constantly thinking about something and not being able to get out of your own head. And that was something that they could then use once they understood how the local people were sort of expressing this anguish. And from then you can almost diagnose it, but at the same time, it's more important just to be able to identify people who might need either support or treatment. And in India, I think Vikram Patel, one of the people who's really, really helpful in this book, and he's a leader in global mental health, he told me, if we use the word depression in India, people would just reply to me, well, of course, my life is miserable. And there's no real understanding there of something that's an illness and something that's just a reality. And so he and his colleagues, and doing some amazing work in India in the 90s at the same time, found that the idiom in India is more about tension. So it's more of a bodily symptom, and that would then allow them to identify people who might be struggling with what we call depression. So it opened up this whole new world. And actually, one of the interesting things is, seen on a global scale, depression is actually in the minority. It's primarily Western nations, and the most common term is actually thinking too much, which is across most of sub-Saharan Africa into South America. And so, yeah, it was a really interesting find.
That is really interesting. Yeah.
But I say I find it. I didn't find it. It was already there. It's just, it was interesting to learn. And yeah.
Yeah. Was researching the history of depression therapeutic for you? And if so, how does that parallel the journeys of some of the folks that you wrote about, like Robert Burton, the 17th century author of The Anatomy of Melancholy?
Yeah, so he wrote, he spent his entire life pretty much writing that book in various volumes. And the copy I have is, it's about, that thick maybe. And that's sort of a shortened version of it. And he was like, a busy mind and an occupied mind is a healthy one. And he was trying to, I guess, not run away from, but avoid his own melancholia, as he called it, his own melancholy. And I did find the same with this. It gave me purpose. And like I said, I felt empowered. I think that it was therapeutic. There were some times where there's probably a whole year when I thought that I couldn't do this. And I think every author has probably been, who writes a sort of narrative history or a topic that's so personal, I think that they will go through that. I know you struggled sometimes with NeuroTribes.
Oh my God. Yeah.
So
yeah, absolutely.
But generally, maybe like 75% of the time I found it therapeutic, because I enjoy this job. I enjoy reading science articles and publications, and I mean that's what I do to relax. It's really strange, but that's it's what I enjoy doing. So it was therapeutic to have this opportunity to really, I guess, bring some, or at least I hope I brought some evidence-based discussion to the treatment and also the burden of depression.
Yeah, that's great. We're going to pivot pretty soon to audience questions. I would encourage everyone who's listening to type their question into the chat box, and then I'll read them as they come in. Of all the historical figures that you wrote about, was there anyone who you felt either a kind of personal kinship with, or you really wanted to have an argument with, or someone who you wish you could, in a sense, sit down with and have a thoroughgoing conversation with?
That's a great question. We'll have maybe Emil Craiglin, because he's the forgotten figure of psychiatry. He has a huge influence on modern sort of classification. Some people put him alongside Sigmund Freud, but he has nowhere near the fame. I think he went through some huge struggles in his own life when he was isolated, living in Dorpat, and he basically lost, I think, 3 out of 4 children that he had. He had a really sort of dark path, and yet he was able to come out of that. And like you said, writing a book is therapeutic. He just funneled all his attention into writing his textbooks, and that's how modern psychiatry was essentially founded, was in his writings and his attention to detail. So I think, but then also I got to kind of understand his views on eugenics, because that's also another darker side of whether he actually would have supported Hitler if he had lived long enough to actually see the right, because he was a huge nationalist, but there's some questions over whether he was essentially a Nazi supporter. But it'd be a good conversation.
Yeah. And it's, in a way, I mean, even though Freud is the bigger marquee name or whatever, I mean, I feel like Kraepelin's insights into sort of the taxonomy of mental disorders have almost been more pervasively influential really.
Yeah.
Like Freud is kind of, he's almost dismissed now, and unfairly so, in some cases. But Kraeppelin's stuff is kind of embedded in, like the structure of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, et cetera.
Yeah, which I think, hopefully, I think that will change. I think there'll be another blend in the future of these two, because the classification system, a lot of people criticize it. I don't, it doesn't really fit with the reality of, it might be good to diagnose people, it might be good to identify people and to study very precise diagnoses, but at the same time, major depressive disorder doesn't really represent the lived experience of most people with depression, and the comorbidity between them, and this is autism with depression, schizophrenia with bipolar. Like, I think we might be going towards a more dimensional approach, which is Freudian, with getting rid of diagnoses and seeing people as like a collection of symptoms, and seeing where there's depression, there's anxiety, there's substance use, and where there's autism, there's ADHD, and really seeing people as a more of a complex picture. I think that would be a really, I think that's an interesting move that is happening, and it'd be interesting to see where it goes.
Yeah, definitely. Have we lost anything in terms of our ability to treat depression by kind of dismissing talk therapies as old school, and seeing depression as a disease, and there is a specific medicine for this disease, and that medicine is antidepressants? Like, what role do you think both talk therapy and medication have in treatment of depression?
I think they have, I mean, right now it's kind of like which one does people fit into? And I think that's the trap I got stuck into, is like, these are the two options. And if they don't work, then, the feeling of helplessness is just then, exacerbated. So I think they both have very powerful roles. I would lean more towards psychotherapy. If I had, a magic key to sort of unlock funds for the treatment of depression, it would go towards either psychotherapy in terms of psychodynamic, or CBT based, or interpersonal therapy. Interpersonal therapy is a very powerful and often ignored treatment. I think it's quite popular in low-income countries. I
actually am not familiar with it, to be honest. Can you explain to me what interpersonal therapy is?
Yes, this was kind of the creation of Myrna Weissman, who works at Columbia. She's an amazing person. She's an epidemiologist by training, but she also created interpersonal therapy with her late husband, Jerry Klerman, in the 1970s. This is at the same time that CBT was first, being put together by Aaron Beck. And so it's more based on the social situation of a person. So a person comes in, it's not about the cognitive elements of depression. It's more about who in your life might be causing you problems, and who might be your supporter, your advocate, your champion, and really sort of diving into these more complex social elements of depression. And I think that both therapies probably, there is a cognitive element to interpersonal therapy, and there's also a social element to CBT. But yeah, I think interpersonal is also very effective for particularly women who've just had children, or who are pregnant and might be, not feeling a connection to the child, or struggling with postnatal depression or postnatal psychosis, and trying to recover from those two really horrible and stigmatized mental illnesses. And having just had a child myself with my partner, it's, you're always on alert for it, because we both have depression in our families. And yeah, I think interpersonal therapy has a real place in the treatment of postnatal depression, and allowing mothers and women to feel comfortable with whatever they're feeling at that current time, and not feeling like they're alone, and that it's completely normal sometimes to not feel like a mother. And yeah, so interpersonal therapy, I think it should get more credit than it does.
Yeah, that's great. And then I'll just ask one last question, then we'll go to audience questions. I'm happy to say I've recently been doubly vaccinated against COVID-19. Do you think it's possible that there could ever be a successful strategy for preventing chronic depression before its onset?
Yeah, you'd have to look at children. So 3/4 of severe mental illnesses start before the age of 18. So, but it's in this sort of nebulous sort of stage of life where it might be more of an anxiety with a bit of depression or a bit of panic attacks. And these are the sort of warning signs that, will lead to more pervasive and more chronic conditions, such as a chronic depression, which thankfully I don't suffer from. But I think between 15 and 30% of people who have depression have a chronic condition and not the acute recurrent condition that I have or I experience. And I think for chronic depression as well, you need to look at the societal elements. So tackling poverty, lack of food, lack of employment, all of these sort of structural things that are often not seen as treatments, but they're probably the most effective treatments out there, preventing the depression before it arises. Because once it starts, depression is harder to treat with every subsequent episode. That's just something that's always come out of epidemiological work. So, yeah.
Is that a function of neuroplasticity at all? Because I've heard a friend of mine with schizophrenia told me that each time he had a really flagrant episode of schizophrenia, that it made it more likely that he would have more episodes in the future.
Yeah, I think this ties into the brain circuitry that I mentioned in the part of the book of deep brain stimulation, and how it's not so much we've gone away from serotonin, we're kind of focusing on these neural highways in the brain, and constant stress and constant depression, which can be separate, but depression is very stressful, so it's generally a double dose of and that can lead to almost like permanent changes in the way your brain communicates, and you can reverse it, and it's not always with electrical stimulation. It can also cognitive behavioral therapy can reroute your these highways in the brain. So I'd say that every severe episodic depression will probably be changing the structure of your brain. The hippocampus has been shown to shrink, and so it becomes harder to break out of that ingrained biological response to illness.
That's great. Okay, thank you. I'm going to go to audience questions here, and I would encourage everyone to submit one in the chat box if they have a good question. This is from Heidi. Thank you, Heidi, for coming. Alex, did you have to write about or explain to people the differences between depression and sadness, or I guess what the definition of depression is?
Yeah, so actually that links to brain circuitry. So Helen Mayberg's work, she's probably most famous for deep brain stimulation. She's an incredible neurologist, advocate for psychiatry, and she did this study in the 90s where she had, I don't know how to explain this, but in a very short amount of time, but basically she had a brain scans of people who had a history of being depression, and people who didn't, and they showed them very disturbing images or had them recall very just like saddening events. And what happened with the people with who were healthy, their part of the brain that's been now linked to depression, this Brodmann's area 25, it turned on and it turned off, and that was the sadness gone. With the depressed group, it turned on and it stayed on and it stayed on, and it kept firing. So there, I think one way to think of it, and sadness for me, I won't go into my own personal bit. So with sadness, it's kind of a sense of depression, but it's kind of depression is more of a chronic malignant sadness.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, for me, sadness isn't really a symptom of the depression. I think sadness comes way down the line of, being unable to move, being able to, I'm not motivated to walk from one side of the room to the other. I have no connection to the people I once loved. That itself creates sadness. It's not really, it's not like I'm sad. And that's then triggers a depression.
Yeah, got it. Another question from someone in the audience. Quote, I have a son in the UK where professional treatment and medication for depression is frowned upon by many, and a pull yourself up by your bootstraps philosophy is more the norm. My son has always battled anxiety, is genetically predisposed to depression, and showing some early signs of it, exhibited in a what's the point, nothing is going to work out kind of way. His father fully subscribes to the bootstrap philosophy. He doesn't believe depression exists. I know that it does because I am clinically depressed. If my son progresses into true recognizable depression, how can I best help him given these negative attitudes about professional help, both in my family life, both in his family life and within the community?
Wow. Okay. Well, I'm not a doctor, so take this with a pinch of salt. But from my own personal experience, I've been that child. I've been that young man who has struggled with anxiety and depression. I think countering those negative sides is important, but also just realizing that being healthy in other parts of his life, whether it's with what he eats or his diet or his relationships, and I think just having that support, like every child needs. So there's some fascinating work from the 1980s where there's this psychologist. She studied hard growing children, so children who are born into adversity, and the ones that really succeeded they could have had the worst parents, they could have had abusive relationships, but they had a coping mechanism, and that was often finding someone, whether it was a parent of another child or an elderly relative, and really having that attachment. So I think this goes down to every child needs that sort of strong bond. And if you've got a strong bond with your child, with the mother, I think that's one of the most important things that a child can have.
That's great. This is a question from Robert. Do you share my impression that the older an antidepressant is, the more effective it is likely to be, all the way back to MAOIs? And my frustration with the fact that they all take 4 weeks to work when time is absolutely of the essence where the suicidal are concerned?
Yeah, it's frustrating. And I do think that some of the older antidepressants are far more effective, or significantly more effective. And there have been trials to show this, that the drugs that were discovered in the 1950s are more effective, but they do have a more dangerous side effect list. So I think it's taking each depression as an individual and seeing the cost benefit ratio of prescribing these drugs that do have more dangerous side effects. That said, SSRIs, they do lead to like sapping of people's libido and their sexual function, and they shouldn't be seen as these sort of just wonder drugs that don't have any side effects. And MAOIs, the first antidepressant to be put into prescription, they are still prescribed, or should be prescribed, for people who have more atypical features of depression. And this was a part of the story I had to I had no idea that this was a thing, but it's people who are overeating, oversleeping, they have quite high levels of anxiety and phobias. And MAOIs, they actually interestingly work within a few days in that. If they do work, I mean, they're not 100% effective, but so some of the old-timer psychiatrists still prescribe these drugs, and just they have a dietary restricted list because they react with certain foodstuffs that can make the side effects more prominent. but I can't drink or eat grapefruit because of my prescription. So it's
Yeah, I can't
it's
either,
still,
but for a different reason.
yeah,
Yeah,
it's still
grapefruit is actually a really big trigger for drug interactions. Like if
really
yeah, I'm on high blood pressure medication called
okay.
losartan that I can't take grapefruit with. If you are on a drug, I'm talking to everybody here, check whether whether grapefruit interferes with it, because it's
Yeah.
one of the biggest. I love grapefruit, alas, but I can't eat it.
I'm not a fan, so yeah, it doesn't really bother me. But
Oh
if it
yeah.
was like chocolate and orange juice and I don't know anything else, then yeah, that would be a real issue. But grapefruit just doesn't really matter to me.
Yeah.
So that's fortunate. So, and what was the end of the question? I think there was another part that I might not have answered about the old antidepressants.
No, I think you got to it because
Okay.
Robert said frustration with the fact that they all take 4 weeks to work. You
Yeah.
did address that, yeah.
Oh yeah, but it is frustrating because the majority, yeah, do take that long, and that's why other options that I describe, ketamine and psychedelics, are so interesting because they seem to work within a day.
Yeah. We just got a question from Bethany. How does DBT compare to CBT? I have severe chronic depression and am receiving dialectic behavioral therapy without much improvement. Might CBT be more appropriate for me?
I'd have to pass. I'm not sure because I haven't really looked into DBT. I know the person who discovered it, and it's just, I think it is a really powerful treatment. But yeah, I'm sorry, I don't feel confident saying whether one would be more appropriate.
Yeah,
I know
no
that
problem.
CBT is incredibly effective, and it has long-term efficacy, which antidepressants do not have. So, and also CBT, the kind of beauty of it is that you almost don't need a therapist to do it. It's more like a homework based. I think you can get apps that do it. So I guess you could try it, and you can. It's about practicing how you identify your thoughts and how that you can take them down different routes. So CBT is open to everyone, and I think that's something that you should try if the other option isn't working or you don't feel like it's suitable.
Here's a wonderful question from Renata, who's in the audience. What do you think can be done to effectively challenge the enormous stigma that is association with the condition of depression, and especially its treatment? Unfortunately, resistance to psychotropic medication is very much alive and well in the US, and I'm sure in other countries, and often greatly impedes the treatment of this pernicious disease in people who may benefit from taking them. Taking meds for depression is almost equated with a failure of character, unlike, say, taking meds for diabetes or high blood pressure.
So what can be done? I guess that's partly why I wrote this book, is that I had an opportunity to hopefully dispel and change the discussion and have a more science or evidence-based argument. And I think, because there have been books recently that have claimed what the woman just asked then of, it was antidepressants are basically saying that you're a broken machine, and and the same with therapy. If you have therapy, then you can't cope with life's stresses, and you need to take it on the chin or something. It's just these very unhelpful ingrained views. And I think with the discussion of mental health opening up, I hope that then funnels into the treatment of mental illness. I don't think we're there yet, but I think having open and frank discussions about it is going to change the course for people who do depend on these treatments. And I think one of the core parts of the book that I wanted to kind of frame was the diversity of mental illness and the diversity of depression. So by writing a memoir and saying that antidepressants don't work because they didn't work for me is just incredibly narrow-minded, unhelpful. I think you need to take a broader approach and think, okay, depression is so diverse, so it makes sense that someone might benefit from a change of diet and exercise, whereas someone else might need deep brain stimulation. Like it's almost like they're not even on the same spectrum. It's these very different experiences that we kind of group together as depression. So I hope that helps.
That's great. And then last question, and this gets into something that you and I, Alex, were talking about before this event, which was, does depression fall under the umbrella of neurodiversity? This is another question from Heidi. Since you talked about how in some cultures people call it thinking too much, do you think there are correlations to depression and artists and writers? I'm thinking of the book, The Midnight Disease.
I'd say that this has been a topic throughout history, and some of I think there is a connection with, perhaps not with creativity, I think, and abstract thought. I think that would be limited to more either autism or schizophrenia or bipolar. I think those sort of really sort of alternative ways of seeing the world are really powerful, and that would be a more creative insight. I think with depression, you have the idea of depressive realism. So the idea that everyone who's not depressed is kind of exaggerating how great life is, whereas the depressive sees what is true. They're very grounded. I think that's a really powerful trait to have, and it's been replicated in numerous psychological studies. And it doesn't tell the whole picture, but I think it does show that there is a benefit to having depression, and also to have suffered in such a way that allows you to be empathetic to someone else. Or I think some of the greatest leaders in history have struggled with depression, and in times of chaos, people with mental illness, whether it's bipolar or depression, are found to be better leaders because they can deal with that chaos. So I think with neurodiversity, I think you do have to not always think of depression as just a horrible state. It does have some positives, as you wrote with autism in NeuroTribes. I think a similar approach could be taken, but the benefits are probably very different.
Well, thank you so much, Alex, and thank you, everyone. And please order a copy of Alex's A Cure for Darkness. It's an absolutely wonderful book, one of the best books I've read in the past very depressing year, in a sense. But you did a really fantastic job. And
thank you. I
really thank you for all the benefit that you will create in terms of people's understanding. So thank you very much, and thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you. Thanks, Evan.
Yeah, I just popping back in to thank you, Alex, and to congratulate you on the book, and also Steve for leading this really wonderful conversation. I've enjoyed it immensely, and thank you all so much for tuning in. I hope you take Steve's advice and get the book. Get it from Booksmith. If not, get it from somewhere. Just make sure you read it. Thank you all so much, and take care, stay well, and hopefully we'll meet in person soonish. But until then, I hope to see you again here soon.
Thanks so much. Take care.
Right.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.